I think I know most of you. My name is Mark Peterkins. I'm with One Way Ministries. I'm the executive director, and it is our pleasure, on behalf of One Way, it is our pleasure to welcome you today to our seminar, Navigating Through Choppy Waters. How's that for a title for our seminar today? We are thrilled to have the Acacia Group team, most of the team, with us this morning to share on a number of different topics. I'm going to just introduce the group and the members to you. The Acacia Group is based here in Ottawa, and they offer a wide variety of services to a clientele of churches, charities, nonprofit, religious institutions, and they also provide a wide range of legal services to the wider public. They have extensive experience representing religious organizations and nonprofit organizations across Canada. So it's a great gift to have them here locally with us. Today on the call, we have Albertos Polyzogopoulos. How did I do?
Nailed it.
Oh, nailed it. It helps to have had a Greek stepfather whose last name was Dimitrakopoulos.
There you go.
Anyway, Albertos, and I'm not going to say his last name again this morning, is the founding member of the Acacia Group, and he has a national practice focused on areas of constitutional, commercial, and civil litigation. Albertos represents individuals, businesses, and corporations, healthcare institutions, financial institutions, universities, political parties, campaigns, insurance companies, churches, and charities. Is there anybody you don't represent?
Bad guys.
Bad guys, okay. He provides legal and strategic advice to his clients on all matters relating to litigation and liability. He's frequently called upon to address a variety of legal matters. He advises Roman Catholic, Protestant, and other churches, providing counsel on church policies, discipline, and membership. And I just found out about this morning, and he doesn't know what I'm going to say, so now he's a little anxious. He is a hunter. Albertos is a hunter. It's a new thing for him, and he loves to hunt things that fly, I believe, or try to fly.
I like to hunt things that I'm not able to shoot.
So a well-armed Greek litigation lawyer we have with us this morning. Also on the call is John Sycama, who is also a founding member of the Acacia Group. Welcome, John. He practices both in litigation and solicitor departments. John works with churches, charities, and other faith-based organizations to assist them with their legal needs, including litigation, policy development, corporate, and charitable matters. Prior to joining the Acacia Group, John served as legal counsel to the Association for Reformed Political Action, also known as ARPA. And prior to that, he served as an associate legal counsel for the Christian Legalship Fellowship. So, John tells me he likes long scenic walks, I think with your wife. Are you married, John? I think you are.
Yes.
I think you mentioned that. And so welcome. We're glad to have you with us this morning as well.
I just like to look at the waterfowl, just
before they go fly. Encourage them to fly away before Albertos comes along. Yeah. Peter Stockland, who I've got to know a little bit more over these last number of months, is a consultant and head of the strategic communications divisions for the Acacia Group. He has more than 4 decades experience in journalism and publishing, a former editor-in-chief of the Montreal Gazette. He was the editorial page editor for the Calgary Herald. He has worked as a journalist throughout Canada, vice president of English Language Magazine for Reader's Digest magazine. And he's overseeing the launch and direction of a number of new publications. He currently edits a web-based Convivium magazine, which he co-founded with National Post columnist Father Raymond de Sousa. In addition to journalism, he is a fiction writer who has published a number of publications across Canada. His collection of short stories, Only If, was published by Siren Sony Press. And he is a student in the Irish Studies Department at Concordia University. Interesting, Peter. And Peter is also an avid golfer. I've discovered that recently. And tells me that he's taking golf lessons this winter to try and improve your game. What score are you trying to shoot for, Peter?
Well, I'd like to shoot in the 70s if I could, but that's probably not going to happen. But if I can shoot in the low 80s, I would be really happy.
So would I. Today's seminar came out of a discussion that actually Jerry Organ and I had with Peter, John, and Albertos back last summer when we were talking about cases, not specifically, but generally. And Albertos made the comment that many of the cases that he got involved with would never have come to be if churches and organizations had been better prepared, had different policies and legal documents in place, and were implementing them. And I thought right away, we need to hear from you guys. And so we started scheming, and we invited them to come and help us to think about what are the types of things that we need to be paying attention to as we lead churches and Christian organizations in the current environment that we're in. And so that's what we're going to do today. I'm assuming you guys might have a little bit of a disclaimer in terms of whether this is actual legal advice or not. I'll leave that to you to do for each of you. I had mentioned earlier that there will be opportunities for Q&A, and so feel free. We're going to use the chat feature with us here today. If you have questions, please type them in there. We will gather those. There'll be opportunities after each speaker, and then we'll have, if there's still other questions, we'll have a general session right at the end. I suspect that we're going to be going till about 11:30 today, just so you guys know. That's kind of what we're shooting for. But who knows? We all of us have time set aside till noon. So let me pray, and we will, and I will ask Albertos to lead us off. Father, thank you for so many friends who are showing up here this morning. And Lord, would you, by your Holy Spirit, come and lead us? Would you quicken those things, Lord, that we need to pay attention to? Would you lead us, Father, to be better leaders of the churches and the ministries and the organizations that we lead? Lord, would you use today's seminar to protect and encourage and further your kingdom, Father. That's our heart's desire, to see thy kingdom come. And so use this time this morning for your glory and your purposes. I pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Albertos, please lead us off.
All right. Well, thank you very much. And Mark, thanks for the heads up that I should provide a disclaimer. So what we're going to say here is for informational purposes only, and should not be construed as us providing you with any kind of legal advice. So we did publish a little booklet earlier this year called Protecting Your Church or Ministry from Human Rights Complaints and Other Lawsuits. And we will be, I think Mark will be distributing this via email in the ebook form. So much of what we're going to talk about today is going to be in this booklet. So you don't need to go crazy taking notes. You're going to have most of what we've talked about in writing. And as Mark said, we are a law firm that is devoted and was created specifically to serve the broader church. So while not all of our clients are churches or parachurch organizations, probably 90 or 95% of them are. We have very few secular commercial corporate clients. We have some. We won't turn people away unless they're seeking to engage in litigation that would go against our communal beliefs as an entity or our own personal beliefs. So, we act for developers, we act for other companies, and that's fine. But most of our clients are churches or parachurch organizations like private Christian schools, Bible camps, Bible colleges, universities, things like that. And we are across Canada, though the legal comments we'll be making today will be primarily from an Ontario perspective. So I'm supposed to address the topic of issues relating to employment and human rights, what the law permits, and where you need to protect yourself. So we found that with respect to churches and faith-based organizations, there are three areas where you can be particularly vulnerable. One is in employment, two is in the provision of your services, and three is in the renting of your facilities if you do that. So if you're a church or a school and you rent out your facilities to other organizations, sometimes you might have situations where you have a clash of beliefs, and then it turns into a bit of a mess. So I'll address those very quickly. I'll give a couple of real world examples. All of those, again, are going to be set out in the booklet that you'll receive. And I don't expect to take very long doing that, and then we will have some time for questions. So I'll start with the employment perspective. So if you are a faith-based organization, you most likely require or want your employees to share your theological or doctrinal beliefs. So if you're a school that is affiliated with a Baptist church, you most likely want your teachers to be Credo Baptist, not Pedo Baptist, because you don't want them conflicting your core beliefs in the classroom. And that's okay. You're allowed to limit your hiring to like-minded individuals. It's discrimination, quote unquote discrimination, but it's permissible discrimination. And I don't like saying that. It's actually association. So when you have a group of people saying, we all believe that Jesus is the Son of God, that you're only saved through faith in him, and that all believers are called to be baptized, but only as believers, that would make you a Credo Baptist. You are allowed to say, we will only hire people who share those beliefs. Now that, in effect, is discriminating against Pedo Baptists, but at law, it's not discrimination, it's association. It's you associating with like-minded individuals. And so all employers are required to hire and fire in accordance with the provisions of the Human Rights Code. And the Human Rights Code says there are certain reasons or categories under which or through which people cannot be discriminated against in either hiring or firing or the provision of services. And I'll get to that later on. And those are sex, sexual orientation, race, religion. They call it creed, but it's religious beliefs, marital status, family status, economic status, gender identity, gender expression, and then there's many more, disability, health and disability. So what that means is I, as an employer at my law firm, or most law firms could not say, we're not going to hire non-Christians, or we're not going to hire Jews, or we're not going to hire Muslims. That would be a violation of the Human Rights Code. But there is a test that certain organizations who meet that test can restrict their hiring to like-minded individuals. And so I'll give you a real world example. There's an organization most of you I'm sure are aware of called Christian Horizons. And Christian Horizons is a group home for people with developmental disabilities. And it was originally founded as a private evangelical group home. But in the late 70s, when Ontario started to privatize a lot of their health services, Christian Horizons kind of exploded in size and became the primary provider of care for people with developmental disabilities in Ontario. And Christian Horizons has a statement of faith, which is a pretty generic statement of faith from an evangelical perspective. It requires all of their employees to sign on to and abide by and adhere to the statement of faith. And it also has or had a lifestyle and morality statement or agreement, which is basically a code of conduct. And again, it required all of its employees to sign on to agree to be bound by and abide by the code of conduct. And that code of conduct had very straightforward traditional things that you would expect to see in a Christian organization. It had, I think it had no drinking alcohol. It certainly had no viewing pornography, no sex outside of the context of a biblical marriage between one man and one woman, which meant no premarital sex, no extramarital sex, no same-sex sex, and so on. And so they had this one employee who had a Mennonite background who was hired as a support worker. And after a few years of being employed, she signed on to the statement of faith and the code of conduct. And after a few years of being employed, she confessed to being a lesbian. And nothing happened. She wasn't disciplined. She wasn't reproached. And about a year later, she confessed to being in a same-sex relationship where she was cohabitating with her same-sex partner. And at that point, management approached her and said, well, you know, you're kind of offside now with our lifestyle and morality statement. We either need to get you back on track or find you a new place of employment. And that resulted in her filing a human rights complaint against Christian Horizons. And the complaint lasted many, many years. Finally, it got to a hearing. And at the hearing, the adjudicator, which is the judge in the context of a human rights complaint, concluded that Christian Horizons did not meet that three-part test. And the three-part test is: one, you have to be a religious organization, which clearly they were. Two, you have to be primarily engaged in serving the interests of like-minded individuals. And then three, you have to limit your services to, or I'm sorry, in the employment context, the third one is the requirement, in this case, that the employee abides by the code of conduct must be a bona fide occupational requirement. And the adjudicator in that case found that Christian Horizons was not engaged primarily in serving the interests of like-minded individuals, because it didn't only serve people with developmental disabilities who were evangelical Christians. So that was really scary for those of us in this field, because that meant, if that's the test, World Vision can only feed Christian poor people. Otherwise, they can't only hire Christians. And then the third test, the third part of the test, the tribunal found that because the support worker was really there to provide personal care, like taking them to the bathroom, bathing them, changing them, dressing them, feeding them, that her adherence to the statement of faith and the code of conduct was not a bona fide occupational requirement. So that was a very devastating decision. That was in 2008. It was appealed up to the Divisional Court of Ontario. The Divisional Court found, no, they are primarily engaged in serving the interests of like-minded individuals, because they're not just serving the interests of the people with developmental disabilities, they're also serving the interests of their staff and volunteers who see their mission and their God-given mission of caring for needy people. And so Christian Horizons allowed them, it was a vehicle for them to carry out their God-given mission. And so in that sense, they were primarily engaged in serving the interests of like-minded individuals. So that was good. But the Divisional Court maintained that being a true believer or a true Christian, as set out in Christian Horizons documentation, was not a bona fide occupational requirement. So that was disappointing, but not the end of the world. And in the fourth part of today, we'll talk about how we can try and avoid some of those issues. So that's real case number one. Now, with respect to services, again, if you're a business owner, if you're a service provider, let's say you're a summer camp or a private school, you can't restrict your services to like-minded individuals unless you meet a three-part test. And it's very similar to the one I just went through. So if you're a coffee shop, you can't say, hey, no women allowed, or no gay people allowed, or no Christians allowed. But if you're an explicitly and openly Muslim coffee shop, you may be able to say nobody except for Muslims allowed. Now, I don't know how that would work, but there's potential for it, right? Like, I'm clearly Greek with my last name. I'm part of a social club called the American Hellenic Educational Progressive Association. And it's a bunch of old Greek guys that get together and argue. And the Constitution doesn't require you to be a Greek to join, but the purpose of the organization is to promote Greek culture in Canada. And so you can be an Italian and join a HEPA, which is what we call ourselves in short form, but we're not going to promote Italian culture, we're going to promote Greek culture. So if you're prepared to abide by those parameters, you're welcome to be part of the club, but don't start waving your Italian flag, because that's not what we're about. And so similarly in Ontario, you're not allowed to restrict membership or services to certain people under those prohibited grounds that I talked about earlier: sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, creed, race, physical disability, and so on, unless you meet a three-part test. And the three-part test is: one, are you a religious organization, or an educational or a philanthropic or cultural organization? Those don't really apply to us as churches and parachurch organizations. But one, are you a religious organization? Pretty easy to demonstrate that. Two, are you primarily engaged in serving the interests of like-minded individuals? Three, are you restricting your services to like-minded individuals? And that's where a lot of the Christian organizations fall into trouble. So, for example, you have two types of Christian schools. You have the missional schools, which don't require the kids who attend to be Christian. And you have the covenantal schools, which require the kids who attend, or the parents of the kids who attend, to be Christians. If you're a covenantal school, you most likely get to restrict your admission to Christians. If you're not, you don't. So if you're a missional school and you have a same-sex couple approach you wanted to enroll their child in the school, you're pretty much, I think you have to take that kid because you're not part, you don't fit that 3-part test. But if you're a closed school or a covenantal school, you might. And I actually had a case like this a few years ago. It involved a very small school here in Ontario. And one day a woman called the school to inquire about their preschool program. And the principal answered the phone. That's how small of a school it is. The principal is the one answering the phone. And within a minute of the phone call, the woman on the other end of the line said, "We're a same-sex couple. Is that a problem?" Now, the principal didn't say yes. She didn't say no. She simply said, "Well, here's what we teach about marriage and sexuality." And she started reading from their constitution or their handbook that they hand out to all parents and all students. The woman on the other end of the line didn't ask for an application form, wasn't denied an application form. She never filled out an application form, never submitted it, and was never rejected or refused admission to the school. Nevertheless, she and her same-sex partner filed human rights complaints on their own behalf and on behalf of their son. And at first, they alleged discrimination on the basis of sexual orientation and family status. And then they amended that to include creed because they were professing Christians. And so the school initially was represented by someone else, and they tried to get it kicked out early, tossed out early, and they were unsuccessful. So then it came to me, and we took it to a hearing. And, you know, by the grace of God, we were successful because we were able to demonstrate that, one, they were clearly a religious and academic institution, so they met the first part of the test. Two, they restricted their services to like-minded individuals because they required all parents to sign a statement of faith and abide by they called it a core family values, but it was a code of conduct. And their constitution actually talked about how their purpose and mission was to come alongside parents in helping them raise their kids or educate their kids in a Christian manner. So the parents here tried to argue that they were serving children, not parents. And thankfully, their documentation demonstrated otherwise. And then third, because they required those parents to sign the statement of faith, we were able to demonstrate that we were a closed school and we met the 3-part test. And so the adjudicator in that case gave us a victory, but made it clear that she personally disagreed with what we did. So, you know, that's fine. We get that we're in the world, not of the world, and people will not necessarily celebrate or support what we do. But nevertheless, because they had good documentation, we were successful there. And now the third component here is building use. And I won't get into this in too great detail, but you can envision a circumstance or a situation where somebody wants to rent your fellowship hall or even your sanctuary for something that you would disagree with, a same-sex wedding, the screening of a pro-abortion film or something along those lines. And there have been situations where things like that have happened and resulted in human rights complaints. And we talk about that in the booklet you're going to receive. And so it's very important for you to have a good building use policy or facilities use policy. And so I'll leave it at that. Unless there are any questions, then we can move on. But Mark, I'll turn it over to you, I guess.
Thank you, Albertos. Yeah, any questions for Albertos? I haven't seen any come up in the chat yet. Give that just a minute.
Go ahead.
I've got one question for you. I noticed in the booklet, one of the things that I found surprising was that as an organization, we can allow our facilities to be used by other organizations that don't share, they're not explicitly carrying out the objectives of our charitable organization. However, they don't, what they're doing is not against what we're doing, right? And so I noticed there is a provision for us to be able to do those types of things where we can say, yes, say it could be a business that wants to rent it at fair market value and host a meeting there for something, or the government or something. I was under the impression that it had to be just other people that were carrying out a tightly defined objectives of our organization. Do you want to speak to that just for a second?
Yeah, so you're not required to limit your use, the rental space, to other charities who share your beliefs. I would encourage that. It's the safest thing you can do, but you're not required to do it at law. The key word there is, if you're going to rent it to a non-charity, you've got to rent it for fair market value. So that's the key part. Now, we've had discussions in very recent times with churches who wanted to use their space in a missional way to reach out to the community. And so we had discussions about, well, what does that mean and how do we do that? And the minute you open the door to I'll say Christians with quotation marks, but Christian can be defined in many different ways, right? In this example of the school I talked about, these two lesbian women were professing Christians, but they were in a same-sex relationship. They went to an affirming church, and they were all pro-choice, but they still described themselves as Christian. So, that's why you want to define what that means. So yeah, you can make it broader, but recently we had discussions with one church that wanted to use their space to reach out to the community. And so we talked about, well, what if we have Sikh group wanting to rent the space? We're Christians, we're promoting Christianity. They're Sikhs, they're not promoting Christianity, but they're promoting religion. So we can work with that, right? And so if you're going to go down that road, it's dangerous, but you want to leave some level of discretion. And so in the booklet, we actually include a sample policy, which has that kind of a provision in it. And again, it's a little dangerous to do that, but it's not necessarily fatal. You just want to make sure you leave discretion to a body or a person. So if you're a Catholic church, you can leave it to the bishop. If you're a Anglican church, you can leave it to the bishop. If you're a sort of a more mainline denomination, you can leave it to the board of elders or deacons. But you want to leave final discretion and determination to one particular place, and you don't want to make it absolutely discretionary, because then it becomes a wishy-washy issue. So that's a long-winded way of saying, yeah, there are ways to do it, but you got to be very careful. Now, I saw a couple of questions pop up, Mark. I didn't write them down, but I saw something about membership and I saw something about sample policies.
Yeah. So Denise she said she's got something about membership. I don't see the rest of her question. So maybe Denise, you want to add that still there?
I thought it was you wanted an answer right away. I didn't have time to type it out.
Go ahead.
So my question is, as you were talking, I was thinking about how people join our church, right? Become members of our church. Do we provide services only to like-minded people? Well, not in the sense that we are missional. We are inviting everybody into worship to encounter Jesus, and then we invite people to join the church as formal members to profess their faith, right? So how does that fit within this whole thing about discrimination? I mean, anybody can come to worship. Yeah. And we have people who are engaged with us in worship regularly who wouldn't necessarily profess to be Christians yet.
Right.
But, we do invite people to profess their faith and then join, and they can only join as they profess their faith.
Right.
So, yeah.
So that's a great question. And the short answer is, that's the best way to protect yourself, is require very strict rules to becoming a member. So when I talk to schools, and I talk to schools frequently, I always tell them the safest thing you can do is associate or affiliate yourself with a particular church or denomination, and make membership in that church or in that denomination a requisite to sending their kids to your school. Because that way, if there ever is an issue, you can kick it to the church leadership and it becomes a church discipline issue. And the courts will not get involved in church discipline issues. There have been 2 cases recently that have gone to the Supreme Court on this issue, on membership and on discipline. And both cases had unanimous decisions from the court saying these are not areas we engage in unless, and then there's a very specific list of circumstances where they will. So the short answer is absolutely you can deny membership to people who will not submit to the church leadership or church authorities, who will not sign the statement of faith and abide by the bylaws and so on. So not only can you do that, you should do that, because that's the only way you'll protect yourself. So there's a movement happening right now called postureship, and I don't know how many of you are familiar with it, but it basically is saying that the posture of the church towards the gay community has not been good. It's been adversarial for some time, and I agree with that. And we need to shift our posture to be more welcoming, and I agree with that as well. And I think this posture shift movement is very dangerous for the church. I don't think it's intended to be, but I think it's very dangerous for the church, because what they're promoting is churches to expand their membership so that people who are openly living a gay lifestyle are still able to become members of a church that teaches the biblical view of sexual morality. And I think that's very, very dangerous. And I attended one of the seminars not long ago, and I attended because I was skeptical and I wanted to see what was going on. And I told myself, I'm not going to interrupt. I'm not going to be a troublemaker. I'm just going to sit and listen. And I had all these questions I wanted to ask the guy, because to me, I saw all the walls crumbling. And thankfully, other people asked the question. And I remember at one point he said, if you're going to discipline somebody for engaging in a same-sex relationship, you should not make them a member. And I think that's exactly right. So if you're going to start opening your membership to people who would otherwise be subject to church membership, church discipline, you shouldn't be admitting these people in the first place.
Denise, did you have a follow-up question to that?
Yeah. So one of the tests that you mentioned was providing services to like-minded people. And I guess that's where my question comes. So we do things like we have a partnership with the school across the street where we provide assistance. We do volunteer work with the school across the street. We have, prior to COVID, messy church events where we are inviting anybody from the community to come in and participate. So that's where I had this question. Like, we don't just provide services to like-minded people. To join the church, you have to agree, but we provide services to the entire neighborhood.
Yeah, so it's a completely different category. So if you, as a church, reject somebody who refuses, let's say you have somebody come to your church who is a professing atheist, a full-blown atheist, and refuses to acknowledge the Trinity or the sonship of Jesus or the deity of Jesus or the resurrection of Jesus or salvation through faith in Jesus alone, and all these core first order issues, and you tell them, I'm sorry, you don't get to join our church as a member. You can continue to attend on Sundays. You're certainly welcome to. You continue to attend Bible studies on Wednesdays, but you cannot be a member. That is totally fine. And I don't think any human rights tribunal would interfere with that, because it would be ultimately overturned. So I just saw somebody say, what if somebody changes their mind? And that happens a lot. In fact, we had one of those situations recently where a church member started identifying as a person of the other sex and wanted to start dressing. So it was a male wanting to dress as a female, and also wanted to serve in ministry with the church. And so the church contacted us, and we provided some basic advice on a legal and communications perspective, and they were able to have a discussion with the individual, and the individual saw that that would not conform to the church's beliefs, and said, okay, I won't dress up as a female when I come to church. I'll do it outside the church, and I won't serve in children's ministry or whatever he wanted to serve in. And the church was okay with that. Some churches may not, because they'd say, well, you're still engaging in sin outside of the church, and that becomes a discipline issue. So if somebody rejects Christianity after a number of years of membership, that becomes a church discipline issue. So your elders or your pastor will probably have to sit that person down and say, what do we need to do to restore your faith or get you back on track? And if they refuse, I mean, you follow the Matthew 13 principle. And if they refuse, you come at them with the second pastor or the whole board. And if they refuse, I don't know, it depends what or Matthew 18, I'm sorry, I said Matthew 13. Thank you, Xander. You all knew what I meant, though. You all knew what I meant. So yeah, ultimately, if they continue to refuse or they continue to go wayward, I think ultimately you have to get to the point of removing them from membership. And again, the courts will generally not interfere in those decisions, but they need to be clearly ecclesiastical. So if and when you have that kind of a situation where you have a member who now rejects the faith or is living openly in sin and is unrepentant and refuses to engage in a repentance plan or whatever the case may be, and you think you're at the point where you now need to excommunicate or remove them from membership, give us a call. We'll have a chat with you. We'll have the first chat with you at no charge, and we'll tell you how dangerous the waters you are in are. And if it ends up the waters are deep and they're quite dangerous, then maybe you'll want to retain us to help walk you through that. But the worst thing people can do is try and handle this in a DIY manner, right? And what we've often seen as well is, and we see it more with smaller churches in rural communities, they have, John Bob, who's a real estate lawyer in their town, who's a member of their church, and they call the real estate lawyer for advice. And the real estate lawyer is probably an excellent real estate lawyer and a devoted Christian and a biblical man, but he doesn't have the expertise in this area. And so it's actually quite dangerous, and it can be difficult to navigate. The other component, and Peter will talk about this when he gets up, is a lot of the times this explodes on social media. And so when the CTV or the CBC van pulls up into your parking lot, how do you respond to that? And Peter will talk about that. And it's important that you be prepared to deal with that CBC van showing up, not only from a public relations perspective, but also from a legal perspective, because whatever you or your membership says to the CBC is going to be used in the human rights complaint later on.
All right. Andrew, are there going to be further discussions about bona fide or the third component, curious as to requiring support roles in a camp environment, cleaning, kitchen, etc., as part of the culture? Does that make sense?
Sorry, can you repeat that, Mark? I was just reading some of the stuff popping up on the screen. Sorry.
Andrew's just asking about, he's in a camping ministry, and so he's asking about some of the roles in a camping environment that are non-teaching, I guess, like cleaning, kitchen, etc., as part of the culture. I'm guessing Andrew's asking, can you ask them to sign an agreement about lifestyle?
Right. So I was going to deal with this and
jump in.
Sorry, if I could just interject that. Basically, I'm wanting to, can I require them to be Christians as part of the environment and the unity amongst staff, being all the staff are working together?
Yeah, so the short answer is yes. The long answer is it really depends. So I was going to talk about this in the fourth session, but I'll deal with it now and it'll give us more time for other questions if necessary. It really comes down to the job description. So the test is it has to be bona fide. And so when I talk to Christian schools, I tell them it's very likely that a teacher you can uphold that. And not only is it very likely, it's gone to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court concluded that a Catholic teacher, a teacher in a Catholic school board, having to live a Catholic lifestyle was a bona fide occupational requirement. So in that case, the teacher was divorced and cohabitating with another man. And she was terminated, and it was out of British Columbia. They have a very similar human rights code to Ontario. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, she's instructing children. Of course, it's reasonable and normal. And that case that's from the late 80s. It's still good law today. So what I tell private schools is teachers, almost certainly, janitors and lunch ladies, that's a little more difficult. And so what it comes down to is the job description. And so what I often tell those clients, and I say it kind of flippantly because there's no guarantee this would work, is make the janitor or the lunch lady lead a Bible study. Make it part of their job description. Make every employee, it all comes down to the job description, and include in every employment position that they need to be able to lead a child to Christ. Now, I don't know if that'll work because it's not been tested in that specific context, but that's one way to do it. It really all comes down to job description. So that's why job descriptions are key in employment matters, and the employment contract as well. Now, as we were talking about that, John sent me a private message saying he thought Denise meant, when I talk about serving the interests of like-minded people, she was concerned because their services are missional. So that's right, Denise. If you were to say, we will not let any men into our church or any women into our church or any Black people into our church, that would probably be offside. But you're not turning people away for church service. You're turning people away for membership. And that is not only permissible, I encourage it. Because the minute you open that door a crack, it just really opens, right? So you often hear about floodgates. The floodgates only need to be open a crack for the other side to fill up with water. And that's what this is. You want to keep your membership tight.
All right. Greg is asking about some sample policies. I know you mentioned there's a sample policy in here for facilities. Are there any other sample policies that people can start with?
I'm looking at, so here's the thing about this. So there are a couple sample policies in here. And sample policies are good, but you can't rely solely on a sample policy. So we often will draft vulnerable children and youth and vulnerable people protection policies, which all churches and all summer camps or Bible camps or Christian schools ought to have. And we have a chapter on that in here as well. I don't think we have a sample in here. And a lot of the times churches will call me and say, well, can I just use so-and-so's policy as a basis or a template? And my response is, yeah, take that church's policy as a template, tweak it and modify it to fit your purposes, and then send it to us and we'll review it. Because there's no one size fits all approach here, right? Like there's Plan to Protect out there. And I know Plan to Protect well, and I refer a lot of people to them. They do great work. They have good sample policies, but you need one that's customized to your circumstances and the ministries that you provide. So, I know of a law firm that will charge $10,000 to do a child protection policy. I don't think I've ever charged more than $1,500 because what I do is I say, go to Plan to Protect, buy one of their samples, tweak it as you see fit for your purposes, send it to me. I'll review it. I'll mark it up in the margins. And then we'll talk about my comments, and then you can either adopt them and incorporate them or not. So we're big fans of sample policies, but they're samples. They're not, you can't rely on them, right?
All right. I think I'm going to cut it off there. I think the other questions have been dealt with on that. And if not, we will have a Q&A at the end of the time. Janice, can you bring up John? And John Stickman is going to lead us through an update on conversion therapy.
Here we go. So you may have heard of Bill C6. In the previous Parliament, it was Bill C8 on banning conversion therapy. There's also been some municipal bylaws trying to do the same thing through fines and so on in certain cities. But this is big. This would be national, and it would be in the criminal code. So here we go. I'll start with the definition. Oh, sorry, folks. So conversion therapy, as defined in Bill C6, is any practice, treatment, or service designed to change sexual orientation to heterosexual, and it's specifically one directional in the bill, change gender identity or gender expression to cisgender, and to repress or reduce non-heterosexual attraction or behavior, and to repress or reduce non-cisgender gender expression. Okay, now obviously some of these terms are pretty loaded. Gender identity and I guess the anthropology attached to that, which the term gender identity was added to the criminal code 4 years ago in certain hate crime provisions where transgender persons would be the target of those. The term cisgender would be added by this bill to the criminal code for the first time. Now, if you've heard about conversion therapy before, and even if you just say go to the Wikipedia page on conversion therapy, you're going to find a history there of practices to attempt to change someone's sexual orientation. And some of these were pretty brutal. A century ago, there were attempts at surgeries. It was really a kind of materialist reduction of the human being to try to find, what is it chemically or organically that's making someone same-sex attracted, and maybe we could change that. And then later in the 20th century, it goes into more psychotherapy techniques, again, some pharmaceutical attempts and so on that were obviously very, very damaging. And that's typically still what a lot of people have in mind if they hear conversion therapy. I think that those rightly condemned practices, which I don't believe it are Christian at all, there's this kind of taking advantage of the negative connotation that attaches to that to then expand it in this bill to apply to all kinds of things like, reducing sexual behavior, right? Or reducing non-cisgender gender expression, right? So it's quite remarkable in that way. Now, the bill wouldn't ban conversion therapy across the board, right? It bans it in the following circumstances. So one, causing an adult to undergo conversion therapy without consent. So, if you are providing something you think might be conversion therapy under this very broad definition that I just covered, it's important for an adult that you get their consent and record it. Now, causing a minor to undergo conversion therapy is strictly prohibited with or without consent, which is a problem. Often it's young people, especially in today's context in particular, that need help working through gender dysphoria. There's quite a rise in young people experiencing gender dysphoria, gender confusion. Third is taking a minor outside the country to receive conversion therapy. Fourth is profiting directly or indirectly from conversion therapy. And last, advertising or promoting conversion therapy. And I've underlined or promoting because that was added later on in the drafting process. The committee didn't think advertising was broad enough. Advertising seems to be maybe more specifically to one identifiable service or identifiable event, but promoting can be more general if you're promoting conversion therapy. And arguably, a lot of if the church is teaching Christian sexual ethics, simply by doing that, they would be promoting conversion therapy. But we're going to talk a bit later about, we're going to get into more interpreting and applying the bill as we go on. So just to continue about how this definition applies in terms of committing an offense. So in the criminal code, you can be guilty of an offense, not just by doing the thing. So if I'm talking to someone and trying to change their sexual orientation or their gender identity, but also attempting to commit an offense, right? So I arrange a meeting with someone who I think is coming to me to get conversion therapy, and they never actually show up. But again, that in itself could be enough to potentially prosecute. Second, aiding or abetting the commission of an offense. So an example there might be, say, an elder or a board member of your church setting up a meeting for a member of your church with a Christian counselor, where you understand that Christian counselor might provide something that could be considered conversion therapy, right? Then you're now aiding that offense. Counseling someone to commit an offense. So an example there might be, a senior pastor teaches a younger pastor or a youth pastor how to talk to a young adult struggling with same-sex attraction, right? So now you're counseling the commission of an offense if what the youth pastor does is going to fall within the definition of conversion therapy. And then finally, being an accessory to an offense after the fact. So maybe you're hiding the records of the fact that these meetings happened or whatever. So back to the definition, I've highlighted here practice, treatment, or service, right? So that seems pretty key. The other things seem pretty easy to understand. But what is a practice, treatment, or service? Well, it's not defined in the bill. There's a lot of criticism of the bill. It's not good legislative drafting, and this phrase isn't defined. The fact that it uses three terms together, I think, means it's intended to be pretty broad. I just noted here that parts of the criminal code refer to medical service. Also, you might see in law references to professional services. That's not here. It's not a regulated service, so it doesn't have to be just a doctor or a licensed counselor. I think it's intended to be more broad, but how broad we can't really say. It's not actually the law yet. There is no case law. But again, it looks like with these three terms together, it's intended to be fairly broad. Now, there is an exception or clarification clause, and that changed quite a few times during the legislative drafting process. And I've included both because we don't actually know what the final bill is going to say. The government introduced the bill. Committee members, including those who are not, part of the Liberal Party, changed it, and so that bill died. The government's going to bring it back, and we don't know what it'll say. But here's some attempts at clarifying what this means and what it covers. So the first draft was, for greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition. I think what's primarily in mind there is services to support what's known as a sex change, right? Sex change, strictly speaking, is not possible, but surgically or pharmaceutically changing secondary sex characteristics, as they're known, I think that's meant to allow that, right? And then second, to a person's exploration of their identity and to its development. That's a little bit more open-ended. And that was later changed to, as you see in the last draft, for greater certainty, this definition does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to the exploration and development of an integrated personal identity, and now the underlined part, without favoring any particular sexual orientation, gender identity, or gender expression. So there is too, it looks like this might be something a church could work with in terms of just providing Christian counseling about Christian teaching on sexuality, on gender, on sexual behavior, and so on. The difficulty, though, and I say that with respect to an integrated personal identity, right? You could say our goal isn't to change your sexual orientation. We probably don't believe that's possible or not humanly possible, but it's to have an integrated personal identity, an integrated Christian identity. The challenge, of course, is without favoring any particular sexual orientation. I think the counter argument would be from a Christian perspective, and doing this in the context of your church's teaching, it would seem to favor a particular sexual orientation, or be, in the language of today, heteronormative. Which, by the way, I think the language in the bill of specifically saying efforts that seek to change something to gender to cisgender, or sexual orientation to heterosexual. And the reason it's one directional doesn't really seem to make sense. You think the opposite would be just as inappropriate. But I think in an age of critical theory and this kind of pushback against heteronormativity, they'll say that's what this bill is really trying to do. And really, that's where these efforts are being done. People aren't trying to push people to be homosexual or push people to have non-cisgender gender expression. They're doing the opposite. Now, I want to point out a couple of contradictions in this. Now, if we go back to the definition, conversion therapy is any practice, treatment, or service to change gender identity or gender expression to cisgender, or sexual orientation to heterosexual. And now the first draft, again, of the clarification. But this does not include a practice, treatment, or service that relates to a person's gender transition. Now, if you look at the yellow highlighting, this seems to be a self-contradiction, right? You're prohibiting any effort to change gender identity, but it doesn't include something that is related to someone's gender transition. Now, if you go to thesaurus, change and transition, these mean the same thing, right? It's the bill is full of contradictions. From a kind of Christian apologetics perspective, I think that's very interesting. I think the kind of anthropology on which this is based is full of contradictions and confusing. But the next one I want to point out is, if you look at the blue highlighting, again, the bill is changing something to cisgender, or trying to change sexual orientation to heterosexual. And look at the last draft. It's without favoring any particular sexual orientation. The bill itself does that, right? The bill itself says, it's okay to tell children that, you may be interested in exploring your gender identity, or trying a different gender expression, say trying different dress or so on. I'm not suggesting that that's commonly done, but the point remains, it's the bill is one directional, but it says in clarifying that you can't, as long as you're not favoring a particular sexual orientation, then it's okay. There was also an interesting contradiction in the preamble, which was the drafting of the preamble was also played around within the committee. So the first draft said that whereas conversion therapy is based on and propagates myths and stereotypes about sexual orientation and gender identity, including, and here's the bolded part, the myth that a person's sexual orientation and gender identity can and ought to be changed. And then as you see there in the last draft, they had removed can be changed and they added gender expression. So it may be that what they have in mind is that gender expression can change, which seems pretty obvious. But of course, grammatically removing can applies to all of those. They're not denying that a person's sexual orientation or gender identity can change. And with respect to gender identity, it's very clear that people's gender identity does change. There's lots of people expressing, regret at having adopted a transgender identity or having sex change procedures. And then particularly in youth, there are studies showing that not only gender identity, but even sexuality can be somewhat fluid, especially at that time in your life. So there are some people who will be persuaded that they're gay, experience same-sex attraction, and later, be comfortable in a heterosexual identity or genuinely have heterosexual attraction. So, like I said, especially, I don't want to be flippant about this. I'm not suggesting again that we shouldn't be careful about how that works and what's a healthy way to interact with that. But especially among young people today, this is the case. And I think that's why this bill is particularly dangerous, in that the definition of conversion therapy is so broad and it's totally banned with respect to young people who are likely in the most need of guidance through these difficult and complex issues. Okay, so the biggest problems that I see with the bill, like I said, one of the things it does is explicitly targets efforts to change behavior. So a lot of you may, again, likely not have any issue saying we don't believe we can change someone's gender identity or change someone's sexual orientation. And that's not really a goal in and of itself, right? We want to understand our identity in light of Christ. We want to understand how God made us and his good creation design and so on, everything that Christian churches teach, and also to live our lives in line with Christian teaching. So, but the fact that this bill explicitly targets behavior, right, reducing homosexual conduct or non-cisgender gender expression, I think that makes this bill especially problematic. Second is the lack of clarity in the clarification clause. It's somewhat ironic, but that's really the case. The government talks about, in a Justice Department document that went with the bill, that private conversations expressing personal views from pastors and parents, that wouldn't be included. But with several attempts from certain members of the committee to introduce amendments to clarify that, like basically include even the government's own language, the government wouldn't do it. And I think there's concerns from activists on the other side that those phrases might narrow the definition of conversion therapy too much. So I think the clarification clause that we have isn't terribly helpful in clarifying the scope of the bill. And then, as I already mentioned, the blanket ban in relation to minors. It's already, I think, quite difficult. I think young people are being steered towards pharmaceutical and surgical options. You may have seen articles on this, even in mainstream secular publications. The Economist has covered it quite a bit. The number of young people, particularly young girls, being referred to gender clinics in the United Kingdom, in Canada, it went from 15 years ago a handful to several thousand, and we've seen a transition from, maybe you've heard of Dr. Zucker, who used to be at the Center for Addiction and Mental Health in Toronto, and his practice of helping children and young people with gender dysphoria was rooted in a mental health practice. And that has really shifted over in different hospitals into the Department of Endocrinology. So it's seen now as you treat it by changing the body with hormones and so on, rather than kind of helping to resolve the issue of gender dysphoria itself, which normally does resolve in most cases. Some studies suggest up to 90% of cases, childhood gender dysphoria kind of resolves itself. Right. And then finally, responding to this. So what do we do about this? I didn't put it on the slide, but maybe I should say just first of all that this isn't the law yet in Canada. So you might want to consider the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada has provided resources. The Association for Reform Political Action has provided resources on getting in touch with MPs and ministers. This bill is going to come back again. It may get, I think they're going to try to fast track it, but there may be some debate on it again. And so maybe try to have some input yourself to say, look, this is what we teach. This is the problems we see with the bill. Maybe you could improve it. So that kind of political engagement aside, I think it's to your advantage to clearly and publicly explain your church's beliefs on human sexuality, gender, marriage, and sexual morality. And that ties into what Alberto was just talking about as well. If you never address this, or it's really absent from any of your church documents, and people join the church thinking, you either don't have a position on this or your position is in line with mainstream culture, that's going to cause problems for you down the road. And I think that, a public, it's in terms of criminal prosecution, I don't think it's realistic for prosecutors to go after churches for making these statements, for putting these things on their website to say, here's what we understand about human sexuality and gender, and even pointing out the contradictions and the problems with a kind of a non-Christian anthropology on this idea of the kind of disembodied self that can be trapped in the wrong body, which is I submit to you not a scientific idea. Second, equip parents to teach the truth to their children, so children understand the meaning and goodness of our creation as male and female. Alberto and I don't practice family law, but we have had people reach out to us, usually when it's already, crisis mode. So, and usually it's in a family law context. So, a teenager is adopting a transgender identity. It's in the cases we've had, actually, one of them, the parents were split up, and that kind of trauma may have been, it seems, connected to the child having these challenges. And then you're getting into, children's aid is getting involved. And it's usually that kind of a situation where this is already a problem, and the child has absorbed a lot from the internet. It's very common for parents to talk about children spending many hours on the internet and learning all about having a trans identity and how transitioning works. And often the way young people talk about it, frankly, is quite disturbing. I could go on about that. I'll leave it there for now. But so I think for churches to help parents understand and teach this to their children, so that children have a good idea and understanding of what they may be taught in school is misleading. So they can be secure in how God made us and how what our sexuality means. And then finally, if you provide counseling to develop protocols specific to members and non-members, children and adults, and to train your staff. So if you are developing a counseling program that you're contemplating, look, we do help people struggling with same-sex attraction or same-sex sexual behavior or what have you, that you might develop a program that says your goal isn't to change, and you don't believe you have the ability to change sexual orientation, let's say, but you do want to promote a Christian lifestyle and integrated Christian identity in line with what your church teaches. And if you do that in a kind of holistic and I think winsome way, it's going to be much harder and look a lot worse for assuming that you could be prosecuted. It's going to be a lot more difficult if you're setting yourself up to do these things thoughtfully, and you're not having a staff member send someone videos of someone who is really teaching some pretty sketchy or harmful things, right? So these are difficult and sensitive issues. Make sure you know how to help people who come to you with these issues in an appropriate and professional way, which I think still can be in line with your Christian teaching. And then finally, I put, be careful about what events or services you share or appear to support. Someone, Exodus International, if you know about them, they're not, they don't exist anymore, but they kind of proclaimed freedom from homosexuality. That was pretty specific, saying you can be set free from homosexuality. I'm not denying there are people certainly who would say they've been set free from same-sex temptation or what have you. But again, I think it's more complex than that organization made out. But if you have someone, the point being, if you have someone in your church who points, shares on your Facebook, or a church staff member shares on your Facebook page, this guy is speaking, you should check it out, or this guy is coming, you could then be promoting conversion therapy, and that's an offense. And you want to be careful about that. Obviously, we don't want to say don't engage in faithful Christian ministry, but it's going to be more important to be very careful about that. So that's the end of the presentation. So maybe we can go to questions.
A question from Jerry Organ about what about parents as responsible influencers and the current sex curriculum in Ontario? John, what about parents? What about this legislation and parents, and they're trying to influence their children to certain sexual practices and stuff?
Right. Yeah. On the face of it, it looks like the bill could apply to that. A practice, service, or treatment. Are parents in having conversations with their kids involved in providing a service to them? That's always seems like a bit odd language, or treatment. I don't think ordinary family conversations or parent-child conversations would be treatment. So I think you make the argument just on the language of the bill that it likely wouldn't apply there. Certainly, I think it would be a more difficult case to prosecute. So with this bill, again, I think it's poorly drafted. I think it's probably intended to create a bit of a chilling effect, but in terms of actually being able to prosecute, I think they're more likely to go after those programs that are explicitly designed and promising to change your sexual orientation. Something like Exodus International, right? Again, which doesn't exist anymore, but that would be the easiest thing to go after. And that's probably, if there are any prosecutions, where it would start. So I think I get why parents would be concerned about this bill. I think that would be something difficult to go after. It's more likely to happen, again, criminal prosecution. There's a higher standard in criminally prosecuting someone, both in terms of how the statute is interpreted. Normally you interpret criminal offenses and any ambiguity in favor of the accused, and any defenses you also interpret more broadly in favor of the accused. So the offense more narrowly, the defense more broadly. It's supposed to favor the accused. I don't really see parents being prosecuted, but Jerry mentioned the schools and Ontario law and policy on this has changed remarkably in the last 7, 8, 9 years, such that this is really a family law issue. So a student is adopting a transgender identity. They tell a school counselor that the parents are not supportive. That gets reported to Children's Aid Society, and you end up with an issue there, and Children's Aid Society involvement, visiting the home and discussing with the parents, how are you supporting your child in this? And that has been, these changes, I think a lot of people aren't aware of them, but there have been bills in Ontario specifically to introduce protections for gender identity and gender expression into schools and education. It's part of the curriculum. It's also now in family law. So just a few years ago, the government introduced a bill to make it part of children's law, that when the government is considering, if a child is in need of protection or Children's Aid Society help, or if a child is in need of being placed in foster care, that one of the factors you have to take into account is the child's gender identity, or potential gender identity down the road, right? So how supportive or welcoming are a given set of parents going to be in response to that? So it's created some real issues, I think, for certainly Christian parents, and especially Christian parents looking to get involved in fostering and so on. I'm sorry, that's a bit of a, probably going off on a bit of a tangent there, but it's more likely in short for parents to have that as a family law issue, which is still very serious.
Right. Okay. Richard asks, it looks like the conversion therapy ban is one of 4 pieces of legislation that the government says it wants to pass before the end of the year. Are you able to give an assessment about the probability of that scenario?
Yeah, before the end of the year. Yeah, in terms of the politics of it, I think the opposition in terms of making sure that witnesses were heard and so on, or during Bill C6, I think they did a fairly good job in that respect. I don't know that the government would need the support of other parties, being a minority government, to fast track these bills. Certainly they're not going to get that from the opposition generally. So I don't know. I don't know how likely it is that these 4 bills will be all passed before the end of the year. It seems like the government could have passed this one quickly before Bill C8 and then Bill C6, and it kind of kept it hanging around. I think it didn't mind having a kind of social issue controversy for political purposes, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know if that's realistic, frankly. But I don't think it'll be terribly long before it passes.
Okay. Xander, I'm not following your question. Can you unmute and ask your question?
Yeah, just in terms of a pastoral care context, if someone comes forward experiencing gender dysphoria or confusion about their sexual orientation and they want guidance, they've asked for guidance on it, you haven't initiated that, does that fall under this bill?
So yes, I think it does. Again, it's important if it's an adult or a minor. So if it's an adult and they come to you and you can have a process saying, this is the perspective that we teach from, this is what we believe, these are our goals in this counseling, and the person that's made clear to the person and they sign it. Say it's a pastoral counseling intake form. Maybe being that formal is not great in all situations, but that you're more in the clear there. Where it's complicated and more difficult and more likely illegal under this bill is when it's a minor, and which typically it's young people struggling with and experiencing gender dysphoria. So that's when I think how the clarification clause is ultimately drafted and how it's ultimately interpreted is going to be key here. So are you as a pastor, providing counseling or the Justice Minister has talked about, only open-ended conversations, kind of exploring someone's identity, nothing towards a predetermined end. Well, again, if you're saying this is what our church teaches and my counseling is in line with that, doesn't mean, I'm not trained as a counselor. I don't think counselors are generally in the business of saying, in our conversation, I'm just trying to steer you to one end. There are questions and conversations and so on that you would understand how to do that well. But obviously there is also a background understanding that I think is going to be different than, I referred earlier to the anthropology of our culture on this. So yeah, I think it's a tough one, but I think potentially this bill does apply. I think a pastor is more likely to be considered providing a service. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a medical service, doesn't have to be a professionally regulated service to a young person that might be designed to change gender identity, change gender expression. Yeah, I think there's room in there to say, while we teach from a certain perspective and we believe differently than the currently in vogue gender ideology, my goal is not to change gender identity. It's to help someone be, let's say, comfortable in the body that God created them with, or to resolve the distress that they're feeling, or what have you. And that's something it would likely be valuable to develop a policy for, so it's clear, what your church does and how they approach it. Is that helpful? It's
yeah, I think so. I think the terminology that I use is more like integrated spirituality, right? Like a consistent and integrated spirituality. So, and I tend to be more kind of client focused, but it is a question, because if somebody says, hey, I'm not comfortable with these desires I'm feeling, well, that's a conversation I try to have with them and ask them, well, what are your thoughts and feelings about those desires? And do you feel there is a more godly way of responding to your desires than the ones you're currently walking? And that's asking them to explore that. And how does that align with your understanding of scripture? And I don't see that as trying to, because they're the ones telling me the interpretation.
Right.
So I feel that I'm kind of in the clear on that. But again, I've been extremely careful ever since C6 started coming out that I've got to be careful not to get myself into hot water there. But at the same time, I'm explicitly clear that this is the views that we hold. So I'm just making sure that I'm not taking any kind of misstep.
Yeah, and I can't say that wouldn't be out of line. Again, with adults, there's the, if they consent, it's fine. And then with minors, there's no defense of their consent. So even if you say, well, they wanted this and so on, they wanted to reduce their same-sex attraction. They wanted to have an integrative spirituality. They wanted to resolve gender confusion or what have you. To say, so I was assisting them toward that end. That's, the bill seems to, on its face, say you can't do that, even if they want you to, or that's the direction that they want to go in. So again, I don't want to fearmonger about this. Like I said, I think criminal law principles means good faith, thoughtful Christian counseling. We'd rather have a case like that to defend than something else. I think that's, freedom of religion, freedom of expression. There's definitely defenses you can make. Alberto and I have talked about this. We talked about, in some ways it's better to have a terribly drafted bill that applies to all kinds of things like, pastoral counseling and what Christian churches have been teaching in the mainstream, conservative Christian and churches, because that's easier to attack constitutionally than a bad but not terrible bill, right? And this bill, I think, is closer to vague and terrible. So again, it's not to say it wouldn't be the example you're giving wouldn't be caught under this bill, but I think it's more defensible, constitutionally speaking.
I would love to see a case where a pastor gives a sermon on sexual ethics and sexual morality, and then gets charged for violating this law. I don't think we'll see that. I don't think the government's dumb enough to do that, but that's the perfect case from our perspective. And I think the way it's written.
All right, we'll get started here. Peter, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, you are going to talk to us about strategic communications, what to do and what to avoid.
Right. Well, thanks very much for the chance to do this. As some of you may know, it's kind of a novel, a bit of a novel thing, I guess, the way Acacia is set up, having someone doing communications work directly as client files, or right from almost from the beginning, getting involved and seeing how to what's the best way, if communication, external communications becomes necessary, the best way to do that. And I'm going to deal with sort of the how in a minute, but I wanted to canvas a little bit first. I think the foundational question of why strategic, why are we emphasizing strategic communications? It's insufficient now to do what we've always thought communication was about, which is communicating clearly, right? I have a message, I have an audience that I intend to get that message out to, and I want to communicate it clearly. That's still necessary, but it's no longer sufficient in the world that we have to navigate. We really need to think about, and particularly on the kinds of issues that we're dealing with today, that Albertos and John have been talking about. We need to switch our mode of thinking to communicating strategically when the CBC inquisitor comes calling, or as Alberto said, drives up, pulls up in the driveway. in terms of what do I mean by strategic communication, I'm going to mix the metaphor a little bit. We're supposed to be navigating choppy waters, but I want to use the metaphor of understanding the media terrain that we're on. And thinking about that terrain in terms of a strategy that we need to go forward. And just as a little sort of almost kind of sideways digression, but I think it's appropriate. One of the many things that I love about Scripture is its specificity. That these are the names of real people that we encounter. They do actual things. They work at jobs. They fish. They do all kinds of things. They do very specific, grounded things. And one of the specificities in Scripture that particularly appeals to me is the specificity of terrain. Our Lord moves through and down and up a landscape that he knows intimately. He knows where, and this is really, I think this is really important. He knows where he stands, but also where he's moving to and the environment that he's moving within. And we get that constantly within Scripture, this sense of him being intimately familiar with the landscape, the terrain that he's moving through as he brings the gospel message. And so I think we have to incorporate that into our understanding of what our own communication is. Again, as I say, especially around the kinds of issues that John and Albertos have been talking about from a legal perspective, like a military campaign or a business campaign, or even evangelizing. We strategize before we do those things. And I don't mean a strategy or strategizing as a kind of euphemism for trickery or pulling fast ones, but of understanding the landscape, the nature of the world that we're operating in. And a primary thing to keep in mind, really it's essential to understand, is that the media landscape now, the terrain that we're in, whether it's social media, whether it's legacy media, is no longer one of fairness or bias. Those questions are no longer applicable. They should be, we'd want them to be, but they aren't. Bias is simply assumed. The idea has taken hold that it's impossible to be unbiased, it's impossible to be objective, which I think is nonsense. But I think actually, if you are biased, you're biased, you actually can be objective. You can't be objective unless you know what your biases are. But anyway, that's a whole different that's a whole different issue. But the point is that bias is simply assumed. So fairness is an outmoded concept. It no longer applies. Being fair to you, being fair to whatever is said, by and large, within the media landscape that we operate in, is no longer an applicable virtue. Bias has become narrative. And the story that a given media outlet or certainly on social media wants to tell justifies the tactics for telling it, whatever those tactics might be. And I came across something yesterday, and I just want to read it quickly. It's very short, so it's just a paragraph, but it's appropriate because it's so, like, I read everything as an editor. As I often say, I read for a living. That's how I make my living. I read and I write for a living, and so I can't help reading things without reading through an editor's eyes. And this, I was reading this yesterday actually on the bus, and it just jumped out at me, and I'm using it not for the particulars of what it communicates, but because it just was something my eyes fell on, and it's in some ways outside of what we've been talking about, but that's one of the things that makes it so appropriate. So it's a story. I don't know if you've been following it, but around that's a story out of Georgia, where the three of the father, the son, and a friend of theirs have now been convicted of for killing that young black man. They believed he was a burglar and a thief, and they chased him down and they killed him. And they were all convicted of multiple counts of murder and felony murder and so on yesterday or the day before. And the narrative that is emerging is is a comparison with the whole Kyle Rittenhouse story, of course, that which was last week or 10 days ago, the story of the young guy in Kenosha who shot someone or shot two people actually, and was acquitted. So this is just a quick paragraph, but I'll explain why it's important from the New York Times story yesterday. Widespread exclamations of support for the jury, that is the jury in Georgia, verdict over what some activists called a 21st century lynching stood in stark contrast to the deeply polarized response to the acquittal of Kyle Rittenhouse, the white 18-year-old who fatally shot two people during the unrest in Kenosha following the police shooting of a Black man last year. So if you read that paragraph, and this is the terrain we're on. If you read that paragraph, most people, your eyes just slide over it and you go on to the next paragraph, and then you get bored and you stop reading it, or you read to the end, whatever it is you do. You don't notice what the missing word in that particular paragraph. And I, if we were doing this in person, I would actually do a little quiz here and ask you if you noticed what that missing word is. And I won't subject you to that, but there is a missing word. The white 18-year-old who fatally shot two people. It doesn't bother to mention that they were two white people. And I don't want to get into the particulars of whether that's right or wrong. The point I want to make is that deleting or not including the adjective white is a deliberate tactical move in order to support the narrative that what happened in Georgia is comparable to what happened with Kyle Rittenhouse. If you include the word white, the adjective white, who fatally shot two white people, then the comparison of racial injustice becomes very questionable, if not untenable. It certainly would open people's eyes. They went, well, wait a minute, how is one like the other, right? But if that word's not there and you don't miss it, suddenly you're being led in a particular direction. The narrative is taking you down a particular path. It's taking you across a particular terrain. So what strategic communication would try to do to counter that is to make sure that in subsequent accounts or in all accounts, or certainly in the communications that people engaged in, again, the issues that Albertos and John were talking about, are there, that they're at least put out, they're at least made manifest in the kind of communications that someone involved in the rental of a hall or faced with a C6 problem or so on, making sure that those words, the words that you want, are there, and they are there strategically, that they are there to convey, I don't really like the term counter narrative, but to convey a fuller narrative, and to make sure that at least from our perspective, that narrative gets out, that the words cannot simply be left out if the truth is going to be told. In one way, a kind of visual way to think about it is that it's, again, and I want to really emphasize this, it's not about trickery, it's not about being devious or any of those kind of things. It's a kind of judo approach, or an aikido approach. It's using the narrative that's being presented by the other side, if we can put it that way. They're the children of God on the other side. It's using that narrative against itself. So to actually bring out a fuller narrative, and the narrative that we want to communicate strategically. So if you take, for example, what Albertos talked about with that circumstance with the school, and the same-sex business that came up. The first thing that you do strategically with that is you dig down, okay, what is the nature of this school? What is its essence? And ultimately you come down to a question of what's its identity. And I'm not talking about this obviously from a legal perspective, but from a communications perspective, what is its identity? Okay, what claim can be made on the basis of that identity? And clearly, in that case, there's a claim of equality. if that school has an identity and other people are entitled to proclaim their identities, then simple equality says that school should be is entitled to identify itself, what its identity is, to proclaim its identity as legitimate and just and viable. So as Albertos mentioned, it's a part of doing that is going into the documentation. It's looking at, okay, what have we written down about who we are? What have we said about who we are? And it's transforming that into language that can be used on social media, that can be used in engagements with the CBC Inquisitor when they show up, within the context of, look, all we're asking for here is a recognition of our identity, of who and what we are. And so the strategy becomes not trying to convince them, not trying to make the argument that we're right in our identity, but that this is our identity, that there's an ontology at work here. And if you're entitled to proclaim a particular identity, so are we. You might not like that identity, but the Charter of Rights, et cetera, allows us to be who and what we are. It's a process of going through those kinds of steps and identifying those areas where that counter narrative can be put out in a way that's justified. In what John was saying, and he was actually going through some of the process there, I think in a very helpful way. For example, with C6, asking that question, which obviously the legislators themselves recognized, about why the specificity of sort of a pointed direction towards heterosexuality. So the communication strategy when you're communicating about C6 becomes to ask that question. Well, why is it only heterosexuals who are captured in this net? Why isn't it everybody? Why doesn't the sentence stop before you begin to define who and what? And you can build off that in a strategic sense. You can appeal to, again, that sense of equality. Look, all we're asking for here is equal treatment. We're not asking for anything special. We're just asking to be treated equally. The gay community or the LGBT community quite rightly bristles at the very notion of so-called gay recruitment. And we can believe or not believe whatever we want about that, about their approach to that. But from a communications point, we don't need to get into that argument. What we need to say is, look, if you reject wholeheartedly the idea of that gays are out trying to recruit other people, recruit people to their lifestyle, as it used to be said, then you have to accord heterosexual people that same equality. You have to allow us to make that argument too. You have to stop. You can't single us out for doing that kind of thing. So you can appeal to the basic equality of that. You can you can argue about the looseness of the bill, not about whether even conversion therapy itself is right or wrong, but what do we mean by conversion therapy? All those kinds of strategies can be, or tactics can be used. The other thing, just on C6 that I think would be a really effective strategy/tactic is, and this is one of the things that, again, I'll call it the other side, used very effectively, is using the voices of people who are affected. So if in the case that was being canvassed there, you're looking at a young person who goes to a counselor and says, help me, how can we do this? And the proponents of C6 come down with 2-ton boots on that. Well, use the voice of that person that actually made the approach, where appropriate, from a media communications point of view. The other side uses, and I don't like that term, but I'm just going to use it for shorthand for the sake of saving time. The other side uses that very, very effectively. Well, that's the landscape we're in. That's the terrain that we're on. And so to the extent that there's comfort with doing that, it's a very legitimate and valid thing to do, to make sure that those words aren't the words that are left out. Communicate directly from the person who's affected by it. Let them speak to it rather than always trying to justify it ourselves. That's an appeal to fairness that, as I say, no longer even applies. I'm not sure I can sort of segue from there into I have a kind of a baker's dozen of things that are more specific about how to protect yourself. But I don't know, Mark, do you want to go to that now, or would you want to leave that for a little bit later?
Sure. Why don't you go with that, Peter?
Sure.
And then we'll go to Q&A after that.
Okay, so I'm gonna I'll go through them very quickly, and then we'll come back to each one. But I mean, some of these are pretty much standard operating procedure. They apply now. They've always applied. And the absolute primary one is when the CBC inquisitor shows up, or whoever it might be, and you determine who they are and what they're about, where they are on the landscape. Always one person within your church, within your organization communicates. You designate that person when you know what's coming, and they are the ones, and you make sure that everybody within the organization understands the necessity of the principle. This is not to privilege one person over the other, to use the common jargon. It's just to make sure that one coherent message goes out, and that whatever strategy you settle on is the strategy that's employed. The minute multiple voices get involved is the minute that the inquisitor begins to pick and choose, cherry pick who said what. People who weren't authorized to say or to speak to us have told us. We may not, those people might not even exist. We don't know, but you absolutely want to avoid that situation. Secondly, in terms of knowing your landscape, answer only the questions you must answer. Do not go beyond the questions you must answer. And that's a critical part. And that's what I've tried to identify in the lead up here, is you decide the strategy that you want to approach. Then you decide the questions you want to answer, and only answer those questions. Stick to your script. And the third part of that is have a script. Don't just have talking points. Okay, we all think in terms of talking points these days. We've all heard that phrase. No, you have to have a script, and you have to have that script in advance. You have your strategy of what you're going to say. You have your person who's identified who's going to say it. You know the questions that you, as a group, want to answer, and you put them into a script for yourself that you internalize. It can't be just a set of rote talking points, okay? It's got to be internalized in advance. What do you want to say? And more importantly, the tone in which you want to say it. And if it's necessary, rehearse that. If you're asked for an interview and you feel like you want to have time, and I would recommend you do, to rehearse that. Put the interview off until you can do that, until you've really internalized. Maybe sit down with somebody that can help you through this, just a friend or whatever, but ask bouncing questions off you until those things come, that script comes very, very fluidly to you. Absolutely key, do not fill silences, whether in terms of an actual interview or in terms of commentary. Where there is silence, the great philosopher Wittgenstein, thereof which we cannot speak, thereof let us be silent. It's an ancient technique in journalism. Leave silences and let people fill it, because we do, as human beings. We don't like silence. We like to rush in. Coming back to an earlier point, never, ever, ever assume fairness. Never assume that you're going to be treated fairly. Never trust a smiling reporter. So a great line from the former mayor of New York, Ed Koch. Never trust a smiling reporter. That is your landscape. That is the essence of the landscape that you're in. You cannot trust. You don't need to be hostile, but you don't need to trust either. You need to say what you want to say. I would say, I always counsel this: record every interaction. And more than that, let the interviewer know that you are having a transcript made and will be posting it to your website if necessary. And then following from that, have a transcript made and post it to your website if necessary. If your words are cherry picked, if you know, going on the proviso that you know, there is no such thing as fairness anymore, and you can't simply trust the smiling reporter. You do have your own words, and you, if they're articulated in the way you want, in this strategic sense, by all means use that tool. Put your words out there for everybody to see, and have a Twitter team ready to roll. If there's a circumstance coming up that you think is going to blow up into a media event of some kind, get a Twitter team assembled. People that are familiar with what Twitter is, how it works, how it operates, and how to engage with it, and when not to engage with it, and identify them in advance. It's probably not a bad idea to just do it anyway, but get them ready to roll. The comedian Dave Chappelle says, you know, I don't care about Twitter because Twitter is not a real place. And he's right, Twitter is not a real place, but that doesn't mean that in its imaginary status, it doesn't convey a tremendous amount of power, as we know, we've seen it. I mean, it can destroy people's lives. A couple of last things. When you do have a media interaction, whether it's social or legacy media, follow up with thank you notes. Follow up with thank you for reporting what I said, or thank you for your accurate reflection of what I said, but follow up with critiques as well. Don't just let it go. If you, I mean, obviously this depends on the amount of energy and time and all the rest of it that you have, but where possible, if there's a mistake, and you know, a substantive mistake, engage it and go as high as you need to go to get it fixed. And you have to decide in advance how high that is, how much you want to invest, but take it as high as you possibly can. Always accept, and if necessary, request equal time and space, particularly with mainstream media. Obviously, with social media, that's kind of a given. You can engage. But again, on social media, it's as important to know when to stop engaging as it is to know whether you want to engage or not. But particularly with legacy media, always ask for it. And if you deem it appropriate, it's part of the strategy. Make public that you requested it and that you were denied. That's a strategic consideration. You may think it's not worth it because, you know, there are going to be further engagements. We'll do that then. That's a decision that needs to be made, you know, at a preceding level. And then the last, the sort of baker's dozen one, which brings me back to the beginning in the New York Times piece, in the coverage that is about you. But I would say try to do this as much as you can generally. Watch for the words that aren't there, because that's the landscape now. That's the terrain we're on. That's how the narrative works. It's not, you know, I believe this. It's assume this and proceed from there. And the words that aren't there is what will lead people to believe the things that you don't want them to believe about you. So that's pretty much it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, excellent, Peter. There's some really good, helpful, practical encouragement there. So let's move to general questions, if that's okay, guys. I'm going to go back to Sean Gaby's question. His question was, I know wording is important and a little nuanced. Nuances could throw off what's being communicated. Are there any samples you would recommend to base some of this off of, if that's available? So I think he's talking about website producing beliefs on your website. Bertos, do you want to speak to that?
Sure. So I am a big fan of transparency when it comes to what the church believes and teaches. So I know a lot of churches and a lot of other organizations are reluctant and hesitant to put their views on sexual morality or marriage out in the public domain. And they're often hesitant to do that because they fear it puts a target on their back. And they're right, it does put a target on your back. But the reality is, the minute you label yourself a Christian organization, that target is on your back. And so it's better for you to get out in front of it, I think, from a legal perspective, so that if and when things blow up, you can say, well, I don't know why you're surprised. It's right there on our website. We teach that God created man and woman, and sex is supposed to be limited to the husband and the wife, and that's it, and on and on and on. And I think people are much more reluctant to engage on that issue with the transgender issue. And I get it, because it's so toxic in many ways. But I can tell you that's the issue that the church is not prepared for. That's where we're most vulnerable. When same-sex marriage was legalized, the church had seen it coming for decades and had been preparing itself for it. And so there was a series of books, a series of articles, a series of position papers, series of sermons. And so it was easy for any given church to say, well, this is what we teach and this is what we believe. And here's the evidence. We have this long list of position papers we've published or sermons we've produced. We're not doing that, and we're not anywhere near being ready for the transgender issue. Now, I talk to a lot of pastors and a lot of ministry leaders on this issue. And when we talk about it, they all inherently know that adopting or expressing a gender identity that is contrary to what God designed you to be, or how God designed you to be, is wrong, but they can't necessarily articulate why. And they can't necessarily point to the scriptural references that support their conclusion. And it's just because we haven't seen it coming. They caught us off guard, and nobody has taken the time, or some people are starting now to develop positions on this and to ground their teaching and their beliefs in the Bible and certain portions of it. But for the most part, you can go on the website of, I don't know how many people are on this call right now, 39. Let's say 34 of them are not organizers or speakers. And let's say 30 of those 34 are churches. I bet you no more than 2 or 3 have anything on their website that addresses the transgender issue. And we need to be worried about that. We need to start developing our teaching on sexual identity. Not only so that we can counsel people when they struggle with it, but also so that when we tell somebody, well, I'm sorry, you can't become a member of our church because you're not in line with our views on this issue, we can point to that. Right now, on that particular issue, John, you got me worried during your talk. Are we in danger of getting charged under the new legislation for profiting off gender conversion therapy if we counsel churches on how to provide pastoral counseling? Because we do charge for our services, folks. So that's got me concerned now. But yeah, no, the short answer, Mark, is I think it's good to be transparent. Now, again, you don't want to be overly provocative, like, I just finished listening to the podcast on the rise and fall of Mars Hill. For those of you who may or may not have listened to it, it's very well done. And Mark Driscoll was a very gifted preacher, but he was very provocative and intentionally provocative. So it's good to be bold. It's not necessarily good to be a jerk, right? So if you're going to put it on your website, which I recommend you do it in a winsome manner.
Okay. I know a lot of organizations would have their statement of faith on the website, perhaps. I know for one way we do, but we don't have anything that intentionally addresses sexuality.
Yeah.
So we do.
Well, in the late 90s and early 2000s, a lot of Christian organizations started to incorporate a line about marriage into their statement of faith. They need to now do that with respect to gender expression, gender identity, and so on. So we did it for marriage. We need to start doing it for this issue. Build it into the statement of faith.
Mark, if I could too, just jump in from a communications perspective and the strategic communications perspective. I mean, one of the things that does is allow us to say, look, here is what we believe, and it gets us out of a defensive posture. Because it allows it,
Yeah.
in that I use a sort of metaphor of judo or an Aikido approach. It allows us to say, so this is what we say we believe. What is it that you say you believe? You believe in equality, you believe in inclusiveness, you believe in people being allowed to be what they are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, express their identity. Okay, those are your precepts. Guess what? They're ours too. This is what we believe. Within the ambit of what you've just described for us, we want we have the legal right, and we want the social right to practice that as well. And instead of us always having to come and justify what it is we believe, or proceeding from a defensive place, let's be open about it, but also turn it back. I don't mean turn it back in an aggressive way, but call to account the professions of others who say, these are the things we believe in. Good, let's share them. And from a communications point, it becomes a very, very effective way to sort of equalize the terrain.
Excellent.
Yeah.
All right. This next question is for Peter. Peter, can you propose guidelines for when to cease engagement in social media?
After about the third back and forth, when it starts to become, when there's, sorry, this is going to kind of sound like common sense or motherhood and apple pie, but when you're engaging with people who you sense are actually honestly engaged, to learn when they want to learn something, or they really genuinely want to know what your position is, or listening, when it just becomes, when the minute that, I guess I'll say it in a short way, the minute the name calling starts, the minute that you are a this starts, just get out. Like, there is no point in going beyond that. And that's the principle I apply for myself. Like, as soon as someone starts to say, yes, you are a, XYZ, okay, am I? Thank you, goodbye. It's just a waste of time, and it can only get you into trouble, because I don't know about you, but I will start replying in kind, and I don't want to do that. That's never a good idea.
All right. Here's a question from Gary, and Gary, you can speak up here if I'm not capturing this correctly. In your practice experience, have those who have been helped with counsel regarding their sexuality in light of the danger of C6 issues come together to form a strong supportive voice to counter, as you say, the other side? I guess that would be for John.
I found, so I hope this is answering the question. I found at the committee, and maybe we're not specifically talking about that, but in the legislative process, I was able to watch some of the committee testimony, including from actually young adults who talked about their experiences with same-sex attraction and so on, to be quite remarkable. They were very well prepared. Some of them had a bit of a practice run with respect to municipal conversion therapy laws. So that I found was really well done, and there was some coordination behind the scenes for that. But I think it would be valuable for, Alberto already said that churches are not, at least publicly, out in front of this gender issue, but for more churches to be public, again, in a winsome way, and to say, about what is the current, I guess, confusion or issues here with gender, and what does the Bible teach? What is a holistic Christian idea? I think if more churches had that, it would be beneficial. And truly expressing that, like I said, in this process. But beyond the bill, if we ever do get to a case, or this ever does get to impacting charities and so on, to have many churches be able to say, look, Alberto said, this is what we teach. We're public about it. We've been, maybe you haven't been public about it for very long, but it is a newly prominent cultural issue that we address from a Christian perspective in a loving and thoughtful way. You have other Christian organizations to back the ones that might get in trouble. And even if you've got an organization that doesn't behave in a way that you think is appropriate, there's still room to say, to a court, look, let's not go too far. Maybe this was inappropriate, but let's not go too far in how we deal with them, because you got lots of thoughtful organizations that are teaching a basic Christian sexual ethic or understanding of sex and gender. So I think that would be beneficial.
Thanks, John. I think where I was coming from was, what is the supportive voice for the churches that do get in front of this from individuals who have truly been helped and steered in the direction that they believe is now their new lifestyle, or they've been able to walk through some of the difficulties. The testimonial voice, I think, is really strong, and the quote other side is using that. How are we, or can we better use it?
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Peter mentioned, using, picking the right voices, picking the voices of those who, and I think that was, like I said, that was done while there were some young people speaking to the committee who said, I came to my pastor or so on for, this is the help that I wanted. And they were open, they were kind, they wanted to hear and understand me. And so I think in certain examples that was done very well. I think the more stories like that, the better.
I'm not sure if Peter or John, you guys saw a recent story that W5 aired regarding the trans movement. You guys familiar with this?
I didn't know.
Okay. It's I'll maybe just put it out there for reference for everybody. W5 just recently did a story which was remarkably balanced. It's posted on their YouTube site. And it follows two different stories of two individuals who transitioned, and one, how it seems to be helping them, and the other, how it was very unhelpful. And the second one was an example out of England, and lots of interviews of psychiatrists and stuff like that. It was what I found encouraging was it was bringing a second thought, a second attempt, a sober let's think about this type of scenario to CTV and a major news source. So I would encourage you to watch it if you haven't seen it.
Yeah, and I mean it's a really good example, Mark, because in addition to watching for the words that aren't there, we need to be attentive to the words that are being voiced by people that we might not normally associate as allies, or as support, I guess is a better word. And certainly in that case, I mean, as we know, if you follow the issue at all, there's a lot of language, vocabulary, positioning coming out of the feminist movement that is really questioning some of the presuppositions, some of the claims, some of the trans movement, and forcing a reevaluation to a certain extent, within a just and ordered social context. And it's really it's important to be aware of that language where it's appropriate for us. I just to maybe try and make that a bit more specific. I remember years now ago, I was at there were two protests going on over porn. There were a group of evangelicals, and then there was this. It was kind of these two disconnected circles of people. There were a group of feminists who were protesting, and this was right at the, not where we are now with porn, that's for sure. Right at the advent of it, I guess, not a good word to use, but and they were rotating in concentric circles. And I was doing a Henry Kissinger thing, going back and forth between them, and they were saying exactly the same thing. And I finally asked one of the feminists, why don't you go over and talk to them, talk to the evangelicals, and you can make common cause. And they said, oh no, we don't talk to them. And I went and did the same thing on the other side. And I said, oh no, we don't talk to them. And I'm thinking, I'm just a reporter shuttling back and forth, but I thought, why not? You both believe the same thing, maybe for kind of nuanced differences, but fundamentally you believe this is an affront to human dignity. Why are you not sharing that vocabulary and mutually supporting each other? And I think we do need to be attentive to those opportunities, not in a kind of crass way, but because we can learn from them and because they can be helpful.
Excellent. I don't see any. Richard had a question. I currently have parents asking me to refer them to a counselor who can help their child who's experiencing gender dysphoria. If I refer them, so referring the parents rather than the children, if I refer them to a counselor who has a conservative Christian approach, would I be potentially liable for aiding and abetting? It's a good question.
Well, not today because it's not the law yet, but you could experience a firestorm on social media afterwards. Is that right, John? Do you agree with that?
Yeah. I mean, it's, again, this isn't the law. Yeah, like Alberto said, when it is law, some of these things, there's a difference between looking at the bill and saying, okay, what conceivably could this cover, and what is likely going to be prosecuted, right? I think they're going to be selective in terms of what kind of prosecutions they actually try to bring. And so the ones, like that, where you say, oh, I heard about this guy, and you tell a friend that, I doubt a prosecution's going to think it's worth it to come after you. But, in theory, it is possible. Yes, I think it's more likely to go after someone like, frankly, a pastor or a counselor who refers someone to another counselor who they know has some kind of technique for whatever, specifically changing gender identity or what have you.
Will this legislation apply to pulpit teaching, to teaching from the pulpit around biblical values on sexuality?
We don't know. It could. It's broad enough that it could, right, John?
Yeah, it's the practice, treatment, or service thing, right?
But I think that would be the best case for us, is if a pastor preaches on sexual morality and addresses the transgender issue or sexual orientation issue, and then they get charged under the criminal code. That's the best case scenario for us, because that will allow us, I think, to poke holes in this law. But I don't think they're stupid enough to prosecute that as the first case.
I agree.
Right. So start preaching on sexual morality now, and do it once a month. Have a series that lasts 12 months and do one sermon a month. And that's how you can counsel the people in your church who are struggling with this issue, is do it from the pulpit. I don't know if that'll get you, if that'll skirt the law, but I think it might.
I was just thinking, a good day for Albertos and Acacia, a bad day for the pastor who gets charged.
That's right. It's really unfortunate. Nobody's ever happy to call us. Right.
Let me just see here. Don, do you want to ask your question? Don Hutchinson?
It wasn't a question, actually, Mark. I was just commenting because I follow Avery Haynes and W5 on Twitter, that after the transgender episode, it was out of control. There's stuff that's out of control with a lot of female journalists right now. And there were also complaints filed with the CRTC and with CTV management. In fact, CTV did their own story on the fact that all of this was going on and these complaints were being filed because they presented a balanced story, what they thought was a balanced story.
How dare they?
Yeah, I did notice on the YouTube channel that comments were turned off. There was no way for you to comment on the story when you watched it on YouTube. But yeah. Lauren she says, I really appreciate this. So helpful. Thank you. Any thoughts on human rights issues and employment loss with vaccinations? Or is that for another time? I think that's for another time.
Yeah, I could go on for hours on that. And Don just called John and I out this week in an article he wrote about an article we wrote. So yeah, we should probably address that in a separate webinar if we ever do one.
Okay.
I'm not sure he called you out, Albertos. I think it was just saying tamp down the hyperbole a bit, which is never a bad thing to say to a Greek. But anyway.
All right. Well, I am going to invite Richard Long. Let me just see if I can find him here quickly. Richard, can you just, before we sign off here, there's a few things going on around One Way. Would you would you thank these gentlemen as well and just pray for us as we leave?
Yeah, I'd be very honored to. Maybe I'll start with thanking them, because that seems really first order. I sense that a lot of us realize there's much more we need to think about and perhaps ask questions and get the guidance of Acacia Group on. So thank you, men, for well thought out, very helpful information and answers to a lot of questions. And we're just super glad that you are based here in Ottawa, that we have easy access to you. So we're going to keep you in our prayers, because we believe God's raised you up for this time to help the church in Canada. I'm going to pray for us at the end, and we'll make sure we pray for you as well. But I think Gabe McReynolds is on the call. Gabe, are you there as well? Because I wanted to just mention two things coming up, and I'll get Gabe to go in a second. But we do have our City on Our Knees event that's been going on for several years, which is the third week of January, where we call the city to pray for a special week of prayer in many different ways. There's a website, cityonourknees.ca, all about that. But one of the features this year, and it was last year, is focused on people in the workplace, and not just business people, but pretty much everybody in our congregations goes to work. Who goes to work? They are key spreaders of the light in our city, of the gospel. And so we have at One Way Ministries a new team that focuses on the workplace, and they're doing a summit during that week on the Wednesday at 4:00 in the afternoon at the Agricultural Building by Lansdowne. And you can buy a table or register individually. They have about 250 spots. We expect that they're going to be sold out. And so we're just encouraging pastors to maybe put together a table of your people who are workplace influencers, and bring them along, help give them a chance to meet others, and just be stirred up about what the possibility is of transforming our city through the workplace. So that's a really critical event that we're doing. And the date, I don't have it right in front of me. I think we have
January 19th.
January 19th.
Yeah, and Richard, Johan just placed a link in the chat for if you would like to go and see that event and register for that event.
Excellent. Thanks, Johan. Johan Vandermeer and Jennifer Parr and Doug Sprunt head up that team, and they've seen phenomenal growth and seeing incredible stuff happen in workplaces, especially in federal departments. So it's an exciting time to see what God is up to there. Gabe McReynolds, you want to talk about what's happening at Christmas with international students?
Yeah, thanks, Richard. Good morning, everyone. So Friends for Dinner, I think many of you have heard about this or have participated. So this is just a nice opportunity to remind you that it's open. We're open for Christmas. The website is active and taking registrations for hosts, and we have international students signing up. We had a really successful event at Thanksgiving. We weren't sure how that would go with COVID still lingering, but there are still thousands of international students in our city, and we hosted about 170 and had 40 or 50 families who were happy to have them to their homes from your churches. So we're doing it again for the Christmas season. So if you can make some effort to promote that in your circles at church or whatever circles you have, we would appreciate that. The deadline for registration is December 15th. So thank you.
Thanks, Gabe. Yeah, so wonderful mission field there. Future leaders of countries around the world are studying in our city right now. And one of the best times to reach them is when they're here in our city, and to use hospitality evangelism. It's a great way to train people in your church how to just be natural in their witness for Christ, especially at Christmas time. So thanks everybody. Mark, anything else you want to highlight before we close?
No, just let me add my thanks to Peter, John, and Albertos. Wonderful time this morning. Thanks, guys. Really appreciate what you guys are doing and how you're helping the church and the Christian community. As I mentioned earlier, everybody that's registered for this event will get a link to this recording, and also a copy, the soft copy of what they were talking about in terms of protecting your church and ministry. So please close us out in prayer, Richard.
Wonderful. Father, we thank you for just the fact that we take great confidence in the fact that Jesus said that he was building his church and the gates of hell would not prevail against it. And thank you, Lord, that your kingdom is advancing in our city, that your government is ever increasing. And we thank you that your rule and reign is in our hearts, but we long for it to be in others. We long that in our city and in our nation, that there be many, many more who would come to know you and love you and serve you. And so we thank you for these brothers from Acacia Group. I know there's women involved with them as well, Lord, and we are just grateful you've raised them up. We ask you to protect them. You would give them the wisdom they need every day. You'd help them to know what to say yes to in terms of opportunities and challenges and what they can leave for others to do. So we ask for supernatural guidance for them. We ask, Lord, that you use them powerfully, supernaturally in our nation to bring about truth and justice. And so today we commit them to you, and we ask your blessing upon them in the days and months ahead. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. Well, thank you, everybody, for joining us this morning. And feel free to say hi as you leave. We'll get Janice to allow everybody to talk. I think everybody could anyway. And thanks, guys.